You've seen it before. A room full of men trying to matter. Voices slightly louder than necessary. Laughter stretched just a little too long. Stories told not to connect, but to impress. One man jumps into every pause. Another scans faces after every sentence, measuring reactions, adjusting himself in real time. Everyone is doing something. Everyone is trying. And yet, no one feels memorable. Then there's the other man. He isn't performing. He isn't chasing attention. He doesn't fight for space or rush to speak. He doesn't seem concerned with whether he's being noticed. And that's exactly why he is. There's no tension around him, no sense of effort. He's not trying to land, he's already grounded. People feel that immediately. They lean in when he speaks. They relax when he listens. He leaves an impression without trying to make one. This is where most men go wrong. They think magnetism comes from adding more confidence, more charisma, more personality. So they start managing themselves like a performance. Every word becomes calculated. Every reaction becomes filtered. Every moment becomes an attempt to prove something. And without realizing it, they stop being real. Because the moment you perform for approval, you split yourself in two, the version that speaks and the version that watches, judges, and adjusts. That split creates tension, and tension is always felt. People may not say it, but they sense it. The effort, the reaching, the quiet need for validation. And nothing kills presence faster than that. Because the harder you try to be noticed, the more invisible you become. Performance doesn't create presence. Performance kills it. Once you start noticing it, the pattern becomes obvious. In almost every room, there are men trying to control attention. They fill silence quickly, talk over others, and push their energy outward as if the moment needs to be dominated. And for a brief second, it works. They get reactions. They get noticed. But something is missing. Because attention is easy to get. Respect is not. Trust is not. The men who naturally draw people in move differently. They don't chase space, they hold it. They're not scanning the room for approval. They're not adjusting themselves to fit the mood. They're not trying to win every interaction. They're simply present. And because they're not reaching outward, people begin leaning inward. This is the paradox most men miss. Magnetism is not built through charm. It's not built through looks. It's not built through cleverness. It's built through stability. Human beings are far more perceptive than they realize. Before anyone processes your words, they feel your state. They sense tension. They sense when you're trying to be liked. They sense when your confidence depends on their reaction. And they feel the opposite too. They feel when someone is grounded, when someone is comfortable with silence, when someone doesn't need anything from the moment. That's what creates gravity. The Stoics understood this deeply. A man who depends on praise becomes unstable. A man who fears criticism becomes controlled. But a man who builds his identity on character becomes self-contained. He doesn't need the room to confirm his worth. He brings his own center with him. And that's the shift. Real attraction doesn't come from performing better. It comes from mastering yourself. Most men think they're listening. They're not. They're waiting for their turn to speak, waiting for a gap to insert their story, waiting for the moment they can bring attention back to themselves. And while the other person is talking, their mind is already busy preparing responses, shaping impressions, calculating what to say next. It looks like conversation, but underneath, it's competition. And people feel that instantly. They feel when your attention isn't fully there. They feel when you're just passing time until it's your turn. They feel when they're not being understood, just processed. That's why most conversations feel forgettable, because no one is actually being heard. Now think about the opposite. The last time someone truly listened to you, no interruptions, no redirection, no comparison, just presence. You probably slowed down. You probably spoke more honestly. You probably felt respected, because being heard does something powerful. It creates safety, and safety creates trust. This is where quiet magnetism begins, not in speaking better, in listening deeper, because attention today is rare. Everyone is distracted, phones, thoughts, pressure, noise. Most people are only half present at best. So when you give someone your full attention, it stands out immediately. It feels different. It feels real. And people are drawn to what feels real. The Stoics treated listening as discipline, not politeness, because real listening requires control. You have to silence your ego. You have to let go of the need to impress. You have to stop trying to take the moment and simply hold it. And when you do, something shifts. You stop trying to be interesting, and somehow you become unforgettable. Listening builds presence, but calm protects it, because sooner or later, something will test you. A comment that hits your ego, a moment that doesn't go your way. Someone challenges you, interrupts you, or dismisses you. And in that instant, your internal state shifts. Your body tightens. Your thoughts speed up. Emotion starts pushing you to react. Most men lose their presence right there. You can see it happen. Their tone sharpens. Their words come faster. They interrupt, defend, over-explain. Not because the moment requires it, but because they feel the need to regain control. But reaction is not control. It's the loss of it. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite leading an empire through chaos, he reminded himself of one simple truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. That power lives in the pause, the space between what happens and how you respond. Most men never use it. They react instantly, because it feels natural, justified, necessary. But most reactions aren't necessary. They just feel urgent. And urgency is often created by emotion, not reality. The grounded man does something different. He slows down. He notices the emotion, but doesn't obey it. He lets the moment breathe. And suddenly, things become clearer. What felt like an attack becomes a passing comment. What felt like disrespect becomes something insignificant. And now, no reaction is needed. That's real calm. Not the absence of emotion, but the refusal to be controlled by it. And, in moments of tension, people look for that. The man who stays calm becomes the anchor. And in a chaotic world, the calm man carries power. Once you learn to stay calm, something else begins to change. You stop speaking the way most men do, not because you're trying to be quiet, but because you no longer feel the need to fill space. Most men talk too much, not because they have more to say, but because silence makes them uncomfortable. Silence exposes something. It removes distraction. It creates a moment where there's nothing to hide behind. And for a man who still needs validation, that moment feels dangerous. So he fills it. He over-explains. He repeats himself. He adds words that don't carry weight. But every unnecessary word weakens your presence. Because authority isn't built through volume. It's built through restraint. The man who speaks constantly is trying to stabilize himself through language. The man who is stable doesn't need to. He speaks when it matters, and because of that, his words carry weight. People listen more carefully. They take him seriously. They remember what he says. Not because he's louder, because he's precise. But words alone don't define you. Pressure does. Because anyone can appear composed in a calm room. But when things go wrong, that's where your real level shows. Plans fall apart. You're challenged. You're disrespected. And in that moment, most men collapse. Not physically, emotionally. They react. They complain. They lose control. And whatever presence they had disappears. But the man who stays standing changes everything. He doesn't rush. He doesn't panic. He doesn't turn the moment into chaos. He holds himself. And that's where real respect is built. Because adversity doesn't destroy your presence. It reveals it. And the man who speaks less and stands firm when tested doesn't need to prove anything. His presence does it for him. There's something people feel before they understand. A subtle tension, a quiet inconsistency. They may not be able to explain it, but they sense when a man isn't fully aligned, when what he says doesn't quite match how he lives, when his confidence feels practiced rather than grounded, when his behavior shifts depending on who's watching. This is the performance gap, and it quietly destroys trust. Because humans are wired to detect misalignment. You can say the right words. You can present yourself well. You can appear confident on the surface. But if there's a disconnect underneath, it leaks. In small ways. Through hesitation. Through overcompensation. Through subtle tension in your presence. And people feel it. Not logically. Instinctively. This is why integrity is powerful. Not as a moral idea, but as a stabilizing force. Integrity removes the gap. No double self. No switching masks. No adjusting your values to fit the moment. What you believe matches how you act. What you say matches what you do. And when that alignment is real, something shifts. You become easy to trust. Not because you try to convince people, but because nothing about you feels forced. There's no hidden agenda, no manipulation, no need to maintain an image. You're the same person in every room, and that consistency creates weight. People relax around you because they don't have to figure you out. They don't have to question your intent. They don't have to wonder which version of you they're getting. They already know. In a world full of mixed signals and performance, clarity is rare. And clarity feels safe. This is what integrity builds. Not attention, not admiration. Trust. And trust is deeper than attraction. Because once people trust your presence, they don't just notice you. They rely on you. There's a trap most men fall into without realizing it. It looks like discipline. It feels like high standards. But underneath, it's fear. The need to be perfect before being seen. So you hold back. You wait until you feel more confident, more prepared, more ready. You filter your words. You control your image. You try to present a version of yourself that looks complete. But perfection doesn't create connection. It creates distance. Because perfection feels untouchable. People don't relax around it. They measure themselves against it. They feel like they have to perform too. And the moment both sides are performing, the connection is gone. Now think about someone who is growing. Not perfect, but improving. They don't pretend to have everything figured out. They don't hide every flaw, but they also don't collapse into weakness. They stand in the middle, aware of where they are, clear about where they're going, willing to improve without needing to appear complete. That energy feels different. It feels human. It feels real. And people are drawn to that because growth creates movement, and movement creates life. The Stoics never aimed for perfection. They aimed for progress. Daily, imperfect, consistent. They understood that strength isn't about never falling short. It's about correcting yourself without losing direction. When you adopt that mindset, something shifts. You stop guarding yourself. You stop overthinking every move. You become more honest, more present, more grounded. And that's where magnetism deepens. Because perfection impresses, but growth inspires. And inspiration pulls people closer without force. At this point, something should feel different. Not because you've learned a few techniques, but because you've seen through the game. The constant need to perform, to impress, to manage how you're perceived in every moment. And once you see it clearly, you can't go back. Because you realize how much energy it takes, how much attention it drains, how much of your presence it replaces with calculation. And more importantly, you see what happens when you let it go. Because these 6 habits don't make you louder, they make you solid. When you listen deeply, you stop fighting for attention. When you stay calm, you stop being controlled by situations. When you speak with purpose, your words gain weight. When you face pressure with steadiness, you become reliable. When you live with integrity, you become trustworthy. When you focus on growth, you become real. And when all of that comes together, something changes. You walk into a room, and nothing about you is asking for validation. You're not scanning faces. You're not adjusting yourself. You're not trying to win the moment. You're simply there, present, grounded, clear. And because you're not chasing attention, attention begins to come to you. Quietly, naturally, people listen more. They trust faster. They feel at ease around you. Not because you tried to control them, but because they feel that you're not trying to. That's the shift. You're no longer entering interactions to get something. You're entering as someone who already has something. Self-respect. And self-respect creates consistency. Consistency creates weight. And weight is what people remember. This is the man who no longer performs. Not louder, not flashier, just undeniable. If you're ready to build that kind of presence, type it below real, over perfect.